Hey guys, and welcome to day 56 of 100 Days of Code. It's Angela here, and today we are diving deeper into web development with Flask. We're going to be covering a bunch of things, including how to include static files on your website, like local images or local videos, as well as how to render HTML and CSS files. Previously, when we looked into web design and we learned about creating websites using HTML and CSS, we were able to create it as a separate file with the proper structure and styling, and we want to apply that now to our Flask applications. And we want to be able to show the user a HTML website with CSS styling. Now, at the very end of today, we're going to be building out a beautiful personal name card application. It's the 21st century, and we no longer have to hand people name cards. Instead, you can create a website, put your name on it, and have all the links to the relevant pages that you need, and to show off your beautiful design, as well as give people your contact details. That's the goal for today. Head over to the next lesson, and let's get started. Now, the first thing I want to show you is how to render HTML files. Go ahead and create a new PyCharm project. I've called mine My Personal Site, but you can call yours anything you like. And in the project, we're going to create a new file, which is going to be our Python server. So I'll call it server.py. And then inside our server.py, we're going to go through all the stages of building up a simple Flask server. This might be a good time to revise how to do that. So go ahead, pause the video and see if you can set up a simple Flask application which just serves up Hello World to the home page. Alright, so let's start from the beginning. We'll import the Flask class from the Flask application, and as usual I'm going to use my red light bulb to install the Flask package. Now, once I've done that, I'm going to create my Flask application by saying app equals Flask, and then inside the initialization for my Flask application, I'm going to put in the name of my current directory. Next, we're going to use the route decorator to target the home route, and when the user hits up the home route, we're going to render the home page. So inside this definition, we're simply just going to return hello world. And finally, we're ready to go ahead and check to see if the name is equal to main. Then in that case, we're going to run our app. That's it. That's all there is to it. Let's go ahead and run this application, which is our server.py. And if we head over to this URL, we can see Hello World when we go to our homepage. The next step is to figure out how can we render an HTML web page which is crafted inside an HTML file rather than simply just returning strings or small bits of HTML elements. Let's go into our file and go ahead and create a new HTML file. Now, the reason why we're creating it like this is because it's going to add in all of the boilerplate code that is required to an HTML website. So let's go ahead and call our web page index.html. And you can see as soon as I create it, it's added in the doc type, it's added in the HTML, the head and the body. Now, if this is unfamiliar to you, be sure to check out the lessons where we covered HTML and CSS in detail, but I'm going to assume that all of this is pretty straightforward by now. Now, the first thing we're going to change in our new website is the title. So I'm going to go ahead and give this a title. You can put anything you want, but I'm just going to put my own name here. Now, inside the body, I'm going to create a h1. And you can see that the HTML files on PyCharm has that tag completion that we see here. In my h1, I'm just going to write, I'm Angela. Pretty straightforward. This is a complete HTML file now. Now, if I want to render this instead of just hello world, how would I do that? Well, how do we find out? As always, it's to the documentation. in the documentation of the Quick Start for Flask, there's a section on rendering templates. And this allows us to render an HTML file as a template. There's a couple of requirements though. The first thing is that remember that Flask is a framework and not a library. So it will put certain restrictions and requirements on your code so that it will actually work. And in this case, our HTML files, which is known as our templates, must be inside a folder called templates. That's where Flask is going to look for it when we try to render it. So let's first do that. Let's create a new directory, which we'll call templates, all lowercase, and let's move our index.html into that new folder. So there it is. The next thing we have to do is we have to import this method called render template from the Flask module. So let's go back to our server.py, and in addition to importing the Flask class, let's go ahead and import the render templates method as well. The next thing we have to do is to, instead of returning a string or a string that contains HTML, we have to call this method render template and pass in the file name that we have, and then that is going to be rendered into our website. So let's go ahead and do this. Let's delete that hello world, and instead let's return the output from this render template method. And inside here, we're going to put the name of our HTML file, which lives inside our templates folder. That's going to be index.html because that's what we called it. Now let's go ahead and run our code. Alternatively, let's switch on the debug mode so that it will refresh and rerun our server every time we make a change. So let's rerun, and now let's go to our website, refresh the main page, and you can see it's now got an H1 in here, and in the head there is now the title, which is Angela, which is the title of the tab as well. Imagine if you had to type all of this HTML into this return as a string. It's pretty painful. It doesn't have any of the assistance that you get from your editor. Now here's a challenge for you. Back in days 41 and 42, we learned about HTML and we created a CV website that looks something like this, which we managed to publish and upload to GitHub. Now, what I want you to do is to go and find your own CV website and then go to the link either on your GitHub page or find the original HTML file, and I want you to go ahead and get hold of it. So if it's on GitHub, then you can go ahead and simply save as and save this web page into your downloads. Now, if it's saved as a HTML file somewhere on your system, that's also fine. But essentially what we want to do is we want to take this file, which is an HTML file, and we want to move it into our templates. Now, one of the things that you'll notice is if you downloaded this file off the internet, then you might have to rename it. Because firstly, it's really long and we don't want to have to type that into our code. So I'm going to shorten the name to Angela. And then at the very end, you can see the file extension, at least when it comes off GitHub, is .htm. And the reason for this is because some servers don't accept four-lettered file extensions, but it's exactly the same as .html. So we're going to change it to .html, and then we're going to refactor that. So now that we've got hold of this HTML page, we're going to try and render it instead of the index.html. Pause the video and see if you can complete this as a challenge. All right, that's pretty simple. All we have to do is just replace the index.html to the new file, which is angela.html. And if that file happened to be inside a folder, for example, if we had a subfolder inside templates, which we called, I don't know, CV, and we had this inside here, then we would have to specify that in the file path. If we just have it in the top level of our templates folder, then it's as simple as what we did with the index.html. So now while our server is running in debug mode, we can go ahead and hit save on this website, and it should restarted our server. And now if we go back to our main homepage and reload the website, you can see it's now rendering our personal CV site, with only one exception. What has happened to this profile picture? It looks pretty broken. Now, in order to be able to render static images, we're going to have to learn how to render static files such as images like this. That's what we're going to do in the next lesson. As we saw previously, when we rendered the HTML page of our CV, one of the components is an image tag, and it has an image file that it needs to render, but it looks pretty broken when we rendered our HTML. So if we go ahead and open up the Chrome Developer tool, which is under View, Developer, and Developer Tools, then if we go to Console, you'll see that we actually get a bunch of 404 errors. And they relate to the styles.css file as well as the angela.png file. That is what this is referring to. And you can actually see we get the same 404 errors when we look at the debug log in here as well. So we're missing some stuff, basically. Well, firstly, let's see if we can recover it. We can go ahead and save this image from the website, which I'll just call angela.png, and then we can drag this image into our personal site. And there it is right there. Now, in my case, my image actually happens to be a circular one, which I edited in Photoshop, but you might just have a square one and it doesn't matter at all. Now that we've got our image inside our project, how do we make sure that that image actually gets rendered in our HTML site? Because here is the image tag, and it's looking inside Angela's personal site files for angela.png, which is not what we have here. In fact, if we had moved this PNG file to the same folder, so they're on the same hierarchy, basically inside the same folder, well then we could probably just change this to angela.png. If I go ahead and restart and rerun my server after I've added in all these files, and I go to my personal site and I hit reload, you'll see that there's still no photo. So why is that? Well, back to the Flask documentation we go. The reason is because just like our templates have to be inside a folder called templates, Flask will look for all your static files like your images or your CSS files inside a folder called static. So you have to put it inside a folder called static. They made the framework, they make the rules. So inside our project, my personal site, let's create a new directory called static, and let's move our image into that static folder. Now, inside our angela.html, when we want to point to that image, then the path is going to be static / the name of the file inside that folder, which in my case is angela.png. Now, if I go ahead and rerun my application, then go back to my home page and refresh, you should see that image being rendered. It was able to look inside the static folder and find that image. Whenever you create a Flask application, 9 out of 10 times you'll need to create it with the templates folder and the static folder. And you put all your static files like your CSS files or your images or your videos inside that folder, and your file path is relative to that folder. And then when you create your HTML templates, you're going to put it inside the templates folder. Now going back to my project, I'm going to delete all the extra files that we created just now in the demo. And I should now only end up with my index.html, which is our simple website. Now, the reason why I want to keep it simple is just so that you really understand everything from the ground up. And the challenge I've got for you is to go ahead and create a CSS style sheet, and then using the style sheet, change the background of the body of this index.html website to purple. That's the goal. You're going to have to change the server.py you're going to have to change the index.html, and you're going to have to create a CSS file. Pause the video and see if you can complete this challenge. All right, the first thing we're going to do is create a CSS file. That is going to be a static file. We're going to create it inside the static folder. So I'm going to call it styles.css. And now I'm going to go ahead and target the body of my website, so the body tag, and then I'm going to change the background color to purple, like this. So very simple CSS code here. Now that, when it's run, is going to target this body tag, which is basically the body of our website, and hopefully it's going to turn the background purple. Now, in order for that CSS to work though, we're going to have to add it into the head of our HTML file, just as we've done it thousands of times before when we did the lessons on CSS and HTML. In order to add that in, we're going to create a link element, which is going to have a relationship. Now, the relationship is going to be a style sheet. So it's basically telling the HTML file that this link points to a style sheet. And then the href of the style sheet is going to be inside static/styles.css. Now let's go ahead and save both of these files and go back to our server and make sure that we're rendering that HTML template, which is index.html. And now if we go ahead and stop and restart this project so that it takes into account all the new files, and then we go to our home page, hopefully it should show you a page that has a purple background like you see here. Now, one of the things you have to be careful about Chrome is that it likes to cache your static files. So what does this mean? Well, let's go back to the style.css and I'm going to change that background color to red. Now I'm going to hit save on this file. I'm even going to stop and rerun my file, but you can see if I refresh this page, it's still purple. And if I go into the Chrome developer tools and we take a look at our elements, you can see that the body still has CSS saying that the background color should be purple. If we go to the sources inside the static folder, there's our styles.css, and you can see this is an older version of our style sheet. So what's going on? Is it because we didn't save this change? No, we definitely saved it. What's actually happening is that to save your internet usage, Chrome likes to cache the style sheets and other static files, so images or JavaScript. And the reason why it does that is because when you visit a website, if you're visiting it on the same day, these static files are unlikely to change. A website is unlikely to update their CSS or their images over one day. So once the browser downloads it, it keeps hold of those static files. This just means that you don't have to keep downloading these large files every single time you hit up the same website. That's kind of good if we are in fact visiting a real live website. But when we're testing, it's a little bit confusing. So one of the things you have to do is you have to get Chrome to hard reload. And you can do that by holding down the Shift key and clicking on this refresh button, which is going to do a hard reload, and it's going to get rid of all the cached files and pull in any new files. So now the background changes to red, and we can confirm that by, let's change this to blue, hit save on that file, holding down Shift, reload, and we get the blue background updating. So that's just something to be careful about when you find that your CSS files or your other static files are not being changed or not being rendered. All right, guys, it's time for another challenge to review what we learned in the last lesson. Back when we learned CSS on days 43 and 44, the end project that we created was a personal site that looks something like this. It's beautifully designed with CSS styling, images, GIFs, and a whole lot more. Now, what I want you to do is to take your version of this personal site and get it to run with your Python server. And in the process, you'll review what you learned about rendering HTML files, as well as serving up static files. Hopefully you've got all your files lying around somewhere on your computer. If you don't, you can go ahead and head over to the course resources where I've included a link to download all of these files as a zip file. Once you've unzipped that zip file, you should end up with a folder that looks like this. We've got our favicon, our CSS folder with our styles.css, our image folder with all 4 images, and you want to move these files to their respective places inside the personal site. Feel free to go ahead and delete the index.html and the styles.css and see if you're able to use the files that you've got here to render it using your Python server. Pause the video and give that a go. All right, so the first thing we need to do is to move the files in here to their respective places. The index.html is going to go inside the templates folder, but pretty much everything else is going to go inside the static folder. So that includes the CSS, the favicon, as well as the images folder. Now that we've moved everything in here, there's actually nothing we need to do inside our server.py because it's still trying to render a web page called index.html, which in our case, it's still called index.html. Now, the thing that we do have to change though is inside our index.html, it's pointing straight towards css/styles.css, and also for the favicon, it's pointing straight to the favicon file. What we need to do is to take into account that it's now living inside a folder called static. So we're going to have to add the full file path to anywhere where we have a local static file being used. So that includes the CSS, that includes the favicon, also any of the images that we're using in here. And if you want, for sort of convenience sake, you can actually just copy this part, which is the source of the images, and then you can hold down Command R on Mac or Control R on Windows to bring up the find and replace. And we're going to replace this with static/images/. So we're basically adding static to this images/. And if we go ahead and replace it in all 5 places, then we should now be done with all of our refactoring. Now let's go ahead and restart our file so that it looks at all of these new images, and let's go to our website, which is being served up by Python, and hopefully you have the same result as I do, which is the same personal site, but now served up with our Python server. Now, this process has been pretty pain-free, I would say. We simply moved in the required index.html, the CSS, images, and the favicons, so all the files that make up a particular website, and we simply added it to our Flask project. Now, what you can also do is you can get templates of HTML and CSS files from the internet. For example, a website like html5up.net, where they have beautiful free templates that you can tap into. Now, consider if you were creating your own personal site, then you can pick from all of these beautiful HTML templates, which you can then update and personalize. For example, if we take this first one, we can go ahead and see it as a live demo. So we can see this website as it is, and we can see how cool it looks. It's got buttons, it's got JavaScript, it's got beautiful CSS styling, and this might be a really good website for, say, keeping track of our portfolio, like the websites that we're building, to have images of the website, a link to the website, some brief description, and then we could just put this up online, and whenever we want to get hired as a web developer, we could point people towards it. So how do we make this work with Python? Well, the first thing we have to do is simply hit download. And it's going to download all of the files that make up this website. Now remember that because we're getting it for free, we need to attribute the designer who created this website. If you don't want to attribute it and you want to use it for commercial use, then you can pay just $19 and access all of their templates as well as support from the creator. Now compare that to a service like Squarespace, where you're basically getting the same service, templates for your website, but in this case, you're going to be paying anywhere between $10 to $30 per month, which is a lot more expensive, but it's great if you don't know web development. But we're not going to be in that camp anymore. Let's go ahead and unzip that file that we just downloaded, which was called Paradigm Shift, and we're going to try and transfer these files to our website over here. So again, I'm going to go ahead and delete all of the previous files that's inside my static and templates folders. And I'm going to try and move the relevant parts of this new website over. So here they've got an index.html, a readme text, and a license text. So all we need is to move our index.html to the templates and the images and assets over to the static folder. Now, one of the things to note is when you're looking at the demo, there's all of these beautiful pictures, but of course the designer doesn't have the rights to these pictures to distribute. So you'll notice that all the images inside the images folder are these sort of gradients. So don't be worried if when you run your website, you just see a bunch of blurry gradients. It's not a problem. Now, what we want to do is we want to see if we can get this index.html to work when it's being served up by our server. Now, the first thing we can do is simply just restart our project, rerun it, and see what it looks like. So let's refresh this static page, and you can see it's got all of the HTML, but no styling and no images. So that is probably because we're not specifying the static folder in the path. So here we've got our assets, and here we've got an image, but they're both inside the static folder. So we can do that quick trick with find and replace. So for anything that's inside the images folder, we're going to replace it with static/images. And for anything that's inside the assets folder, we're going to replace it with static.assets. And now if we go ahead and hit save and refresh this page, you can see it's now rendering the images as these sort of gradients, and it's also rendering the styling and CSS. Now, how would you edit this? Well, the easiest way is, of course, to actually just edit this raw HTML. So you can take any of this HTML and you already understand what most of it does. You've got tables, you've got headings, you've got H1s, all sorts of tags in here. And you can edit it just like that. For example, if we scroll up to the very top, we can change the title to a name, for example, Angela's Portfolio. And we can change the H1, which says Paradigm Shift, to our own name, for example. And now when I hit save and I refresh over here, you can see all of that being reflected. Now, there's an even better way of editing HTML in Chrome, all thanks to the Chrome Developer Tools. If we open up the Chrome Developer Tools and go to the console, we can actually type a little bit of JavaScript to make anything on our web page editable. So to write this, we tap into the document, which is this entire HTML document, and then we tap into the body, which is everything inside the body tag, which is the content of the website. And then we can call on a property called content editable, and we can set that to true. Now note here that in JavaScript, the true Boolean is spelt out with a lower t, not capital T like in Python. But the rest of it is pretty standard code and we can all understand that. Now, once I hit enter and that goes through, I can close down this pane and now watch this. I can now edit anything that's on this website. All of these paragraphs or any bits of text is now completely editable. Now, what if you want to delete some of these elements? What would be the easiest way to do that? Well, you can simply open up the Chrome Developer Tools, and then we can use this little button here to select any element. So maybe we want to get rid of this paragraph here. Well, I can select it, it locates it in the HTML, and I can just hit backspace. So I can select any part of the HTML elements that I don't like. For example, if I want to get rid of this whole section, well, I would select it and then delete it. Maybe I could delete some more sections and make this a lot simpler. And now you can see this website just has 2 sections, my name and my contact details. One of the unfortunate things though is that all of the changes that you're making here, even though you can see it and it's great, as soon as you hit refresh, all of those changes will disappear. And the reason is because when you hit refresh, what's happening is your browser is going to your server at this address and requesting all of the HTML and CSS files, which of course comes from over here. So this is unchanged by what we've done just now. It's completely not changed at all. So if you want all of these changes that you've made in the HTML, then what you have to do is actually save this web page as it is. And then you can move this HTML into your templates, and you can see that this is now a lot shorter with all of the changes that we made previously. And you can replace this with what's inside your index.html. This is probably one of the easiest ways of modifying a pre-built template. And you can see that there's plenty of templates for you to play around with. In fact, in the next lesson, when we're creating our final project, you're going to be editing this identity template completely from scratch. And you're going to be creating a digital name card. So have a play around, and once you're done, head over to the next lesson and complete the final project. All right, so let's go ahead and run through the solution. The first thing I'm going to do is to head over to the website and download the template. Once I've downloaded the template, I'm going to unzip the file and get access to all the files inside. Now, I've already set up my Flask server, which is pretty simple by now. I've created my app, I've set up the home route, and I've set my app to run on debug mode. Now I have to create the necessary directories. So I'm going to need a directory called templates, and I'm also going to need one called static. With those 2 folders in place, I can now start moving over the relevant parts of these files. Index.html goes into templates, assets, and images go into static. Now, one of the first things we're going to try and do is just to see if this works. So we're going to start up our server and try to render that index.html. And if you've got another project running in the background which is using up our server address, then you're going to get an error that says address already in use. So just make sure you stop any other files from running and then run this again. So here's our web page with just the HTML. It's very, very simple, and it doesn't have any of the styling or the images. So we're going to have to fix that by going into the index.html and figuring out which parts of it need to be changed. Now, notice that in the download, we got 2 folders, assets and images, which are now both inside static. So we're going to have to find and replace anything that is assets and change that to static/assets, and also do the same with images. There's actually not a lot of code in here. You can pretty much scroll from the top to the bottom and you can see there's not a lot of stuff here. So now that we've fixed those paths, let's see if we can hit save and go back to refresh our website. Now, if you're getting what I'm seeing here, which is the CSS file being rendered from the previous project where we got hold of the portfolio site, That, remember, is because the CSS file is a static file and it's being cached by the Chrome browser. So as I mentioned before, you have to hold down Shift and hit refresh in order to get the new static files to come over. So now that we've got all of this, it's time to actually edit the text and the links. Going into here, we can see that here is the H1, which we can change quite easily. And you can, of course, add your hrefs to these links for Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, copy your Twitter URL, and change the href here to that if you wish. And you can change the footer as well. Now remember, because we didn't buy these templates and we're using it for personal use, we should really attribute the source where we got it from. So I'll just leave that as it is. Now if I hit save, you can see I've pretty much updated all the text to what I want. And you can see that this avatar image has disappeared. And the reason is because when I was doing the finding and replacing, I wasn't careful enough and I didn't add in the final trailing slash, which should in fact be right here. So this is going to now render the avatar image, but of course at the moment it's just this blank gradient image inside the images folder. So what we can do is we can simply replace it with our own image. So here in my downloads folder, I've got an image called angela.png. So I'm going to move my own image into the images folder and refactor that. And then back in our index.html, I'm going to point towards that image by changing this file path. So now I can go ahead and delete this avatar image. And if I hit save and go back to my website, you can see my photo now shows up inside the image. The next thing I want to add is a background image under this gradient here. So one of the best places to find great images for commercial use is a website called Unsplash. So if we look for some sort of image that we could put as the background, maybe a beach or a sea, you can see there's thousands of images that you can choose from, and they all look incredibly beautiful and they're all large, all HD. I've decided to go with this picture of the seashore, and if I go ahead and click on download free, it should download the large JPEG image onto my computer. So now I'm going to go ahead and rename that image to the same name as the original background image, which is just bg.jpg. Like that. And now I can delete this file and replace it with my own background. So remember that the background image here is actually being rendered from the CSS files. And if you look inside the main.css, you can see here where it sets the background image, it's actually generating a gradient and it's overlaying that on top of something inside the images folder called bg.jpg. So instead of changing it all over here, all we just did is just name our image the same as what they had before. Now, if we go ahead and rerun our website, go back to our website and hard reload, remember by holding down Shift and clicking on the reload button, you can see that image has now been brought in behind this gradient. Now, the last step is to change that title so that it says our name instead of a placeholder text. So let's go ahead and change the title to our name, and there we have it. We're now serving up this beautiful website, which we got completely from a template that somebody else has developed. And all we needed to do was to have enough understanding of HTML, CSS, and how Python servers work in order to customize it for our own purposes. I hope you enjoyed building this with me, and I hope you'll look through some of the other templates and start messing around with some of them to create your own custom websites.